more seconds. Thank you. I'm just going to give a few more seconds for participants to join. We're at 91 joining us already, which is great. We've got quite a few more signed on though, and though not everyone always joins, it would just be nice to see if a few more join us. So we'll give people a couple more minutes and I will start properly then. Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar on measuring and managing carbon on commons, looking at some of the opportunities and challenges that this faces. My name is Sam Caraway. I'm the project manager for our Upland Commons, which is a Heritage Lottery funded project working with commoners and commons owners to secure the sustainable collaborative management of upland commons. And we've got some people that we've been working with in the project here today. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. We have a few more people coming in and joining us, so hopefully as many as possible will catch this, and I might just mention this again as we go on. Can I ask you to use the chat for any technical issues that you have, and to use the Q&A for any questions that you've got for participants. And I would also really recommend you to look at the Q&A and upvote any questions that you consider interesting that you want to have answered, because what we find is that there are more questions in the Q&A than we have a chance to answer. And we will try and answer some of those as we go along, and some of those in the Q&A session. And we'll also email out any late answers to questions in the Q&A. But if there's anything you really want answered, go in and upvote other people's questions. It really helps us. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording of it will be available on YouTube. As members of the public, you're not actually being shown on screen, and you're not speaking, so all that will be recorded from you is what you put in the Q&A. Other than to just give you a brief outline of what we've got today, so we have apologies have been given by Tom Stratton from the Duchy of Cornwall, who was going to speak and give the Commons owner's perspective on this. Sadly, he's been called away at the last minute. Obviously, managing carbon is something where commons owners and commoners have different sets of rights and different influences on the common, and it's something where we really fit where success really relies on both working together. So it's a shame that Tom couldn't join us, but he sent us his best wishes. Other than that, we're going to hear first from Becky Wilson from the Farm Carbon Toolkit about producing a commons-proofed farm calculator. And then Alan, our project officer, will be talking to Will Rawling and Vicky Holiday from Kinniside Commoners about their experience of testing that commons calculator with Becky. Then there'll be a Q&A covering those two sessions. So any questions you've got for them, please put them in the Q&A and they'll be answered then. We'll then go on to hear from David Jones, Chief Executive CO2 Eco, and Rosie Snowden from the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, and there'll be a separate Q&A for those two at the end of that. So without further ado, thank you very much for coming along, and I'm going to hand over to Becky Wilson to give her talk. I'm sorry, one last thing I should say before Becky starts is we've just got a poll coming up here just to give an idea of, it's really useful for us to know what your background is. So if you could fill in the poll while Becky's putting her slides up on screen, just so we can understand who we've got in the audience, it's really useful for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, hopefully you've had a bit of time to do your poll, and if you don't want to listen to what I'm saying, you can carry on with your poll. But yeah, thanks ever so much for that introduction, Sam. I'm really excited to be here with you this evening to talk about the work that we've been doing, piloting up on Kinniside, around understanding how we manage and measure carbon on commons. So as Sam said, I work for the Farm Carbon Toolkit. We're a farmer-led organisation, really aiming to try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy resilience, improving soil health, with a big focus on what that does to your business resilience over the long term. So we have a variety of different things that we get involved with. We do a lot of work in terms of how we measure carbon. And what I'll be talking to you a little bit about this evening is the work that we've been doing over the last year, really trying to understand how we can create a version of a carbon calculator which best fits the needs of when we try and measure what's happening across our upland habitats, specifically around our commons. So we do measurement in terms of carbon calculators. We also have a toolkit which allows you to understand, well, what does that mean? And then we spend a lot of time looking at how this sort of works with farmers around applied research, around what next, and how we can use this information to really look at what's possible. So I suppose just to sort of get everyone up to speed in terms of why we need to think about these sort of things, if you think about some of those bigger picture things around why do we need to manage carbon on the farm, well, you know, if we think about that from a bigger picture perspective, well, we have national targets in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. We have our net zero targets, which means that for the UK, we're going to be net zero by 2050. For the industry, the aspiration that the NFU has put forward is that we will be there 10 years earlier by 2040. And whether that's coming in terms of from our government policies, in terms of looking at our decarbonisation strategies, or whether we're starting to see those pressures coming down through our supply chains, certainly if we go sort of outside of the farm, there's lots of these levers that are now starting to be pulled in terms of helping realise our ambitions in terms of those net zero targets that we have. We need to remember that obviously within agriculture, we are one of those only industries that offers that solution in terms of looking at not just where we're providing emissions, but also what we can do in terms of providing that solution through how we hold carbon on the farm. We also know that, as I say, we are moving into a really uncertain future. And so again, with changes in what's happening in terms of BPS payments, in terms of where land management and natural capital starts to be one of those things that we're starting to be accounted for. So we've got those bigger picture things that are going on. But if we zoom down and think about actually why do we manage these things at a farm level, where it makes complete business sense, where there's a really good relationship between efficient use of resources and a reduction in our carbon footprint. So there are things that we can do that actually will help reduce the cost of what's coming onto the farm and help with our business performance. It allows us to be more informed and make decisions. So when we're thinking about our management options moving forward, about how we might be managing our in-buy land, what might be some of the options that we can do, we can think about that from a carbon perspective, as well as a business performance, practicalities, and all those sort of things. It enables a positive narrative, and there's a real need for us to have that positive narrative for our industry. We can, as I say, agriculture does deliver one of those solutions, but we need to be able to have the metrics and the models to be able to back that up. It creates more resilient businesses in terms of allowing us to understand what we can do around those inputs and also future-proofing us, and it potentially creates a market advantage. So there's some drivers behind why we need to think about managing carbon on the farm. And the whole process of managing carbon on the farm starts by being able to measure it. Because if we can't measure it, we can't manage it, because measuring it is that first vital step in terms of being able to quantify the contribution that that farm is making to climate change. And as I've already said, we're dealing in a slightly more complex system because it's biological, it's food production, weather, and all those sorts of things. But we need to be sort of undaunted by that complexity to understand what can we possibly do. So measurement is the first step. But then also thinking about actually what can we do and how can we understand that measurement to be able to identify what we then might be able to do on the farm. And how can we then split that up into what are the management options that are available for us within our in-by land in terms of resource use efficiency, in terms of grazing management, soil management, fertilizer, all that sort of thing. And then how can we also understand what's happening across our commons, which are providing a key part of what we're doing in terms of that management. As I say, agriculture is unique in terms of its ability to provide that solution. And so it's very important that we have a metric that adequately takes account of what's happening in terms of the carbon that we are sequestering through our management processes. Then it's about using that information to actually say, well, how can we use this to say, where are we now? What's our baseline and where might we be able to move in the future? So that's what we need to think about when we're thinking about managing carbon on the farm, those bigger picture things, but also how do we measure it? We start thinking about how do we do that and we apply those principles in areas of common land, we have quite a few challenges. And one of the really exciting parts as part of this project has been this ability to be able to talk to multiple different groups of people, farmers, graziers, others who are sort of thinking about how this might work. And we can obviously think about it from an accounting perspective, but actually what does it mean from a practical perspective? And these are some of the things that we had discussions around. So we know that, as I say, these areas are going to be storing a lot of carbon underneath them. But when we then think about actually what do we include as part of that calculation, we need that additional sequestration. And how do we apportion that out, or how do we account for that when we've got multiple graziers that might be doing things in a slightly different way? How do we separate out what's happening within that in-by land and actually what's happening on the common? Because again, our mitigation options might be slightly different, but they are incredibly important in terms of being interlinked between the two. How do we understand in terms of making sure that we can include what's happening in the common land within that footprint, but also be able to move it in a slightly separate area? Thinking about what actually can we do? So we know, as I've said, that we can provide these climate solutions, but how can we do that when potentially we might have existing restrictions in place as part of existing stewardship schemes where we've got potentially prescriptive management in terms of how these areas are managed, which may well be in terms of how we're managing them for biodiversity. Whereas when we're thinking about the options for enhanced carbon sequestration, potentially we need to think slightly more widely. What's going on in terms of how much carbon is in these soils, in these habitats? Because again, there's quite a lack of information out there in terms of what's happening. How is these landscapes managed? So actually, are they managed in a way where we can actually put those into the models so that we know what's happening, or do we need to think more of a sort of a measurement-based system? Now, I know we're going to have a conversation later and Rosie's going to tell us about what's happening around peat. But again, where we have got commons that have peat within them, actually, is that providing part of the solution through that restoration, or is it currently providing emissions? And that's a key part of the discussion. Allocation, lots and lots of discussion around allocation. Well, actually, how do we allocate that? How do we split within a farm in terms of what's in the in-by and the common, but actually in terms of where we have those areas where we've got multiple grazers, how does that get split? The list goes on. So that's just a few of the things that we've been thinking about in terms of where we've started to try and pull this tool together. So we've been really, really excited and thrilled to work, on this project, really starting to think about how we do this. And this is sort of shows the process that we've been through in terms of understanding what's happening. So, and we've been really, really thrilled to work with Kinniside as the pilot for this project. But there's been various different questions that we've asked along the way. So there's sort of understanding and background research in terms of where are the current data gaps, what has happened over the past few years, and what still needs to happen in terms of populating figures in terms of emissions factors that represent what's happening in terms of those conditions that we're finding in upland environments, but also on commons. So there's been a sort of back-end desk type research that's happened. But also we've used Kinniside as a sort of guinea pig to then say, well, actually, does this research that we've done, has that actually started to feed through? So we've got the information that we need. And at the same time, understanding, you know, where that prior experience is coming from in terms of use of those tools. And all of that has fed into the development of the new tool. And that new tool has then obviously been trialed with the farmers on Kinniside to see actually how does it work in practice, because it's all very well doing these things from a theoretical perspective, but actually it's got to be something that is a genuinely useful tool that is actually providing information that is helpful and can help with those further management decisions and those wider context things that I've already spoken about. So we've put that data through the tool in terms of using that as a pilot. The feedback has then been fed back in to the final version of the tool, which is just being sort of final tweaks being done at the moment. And then obviously that will then be available to be used more widely. So, as I say, we've been doing research in terms of, do we have enough data and body of evidence to be able to provide that sort of specific upland emissions factors, so that we've got figures that we feel comfortable are adequately representing what's happening. Thinking about actually, let's say from the farmer's point of view, actually how can we create this in a way which makes sense, which helps, which adds value and provides something which is genuinely useful, and then thinking about, as I say, taking Kinniside through this project to make sure that we've got something that works. So where are we in terms of how this is working currently? And again, this is sort of some screenshots which shows what's working, but this will be, as I say, before too long it will be available and hopefully to be rolled out more widely. So we obviously have had the existing calculator, which is what we've used as the starting point, but the new tool has two key differences. First one, for commoners, there is the ability to include that commons allocation as part of your footprint. So there is the ability to report your in-buy and your common land separately, and also then to put them together. And for the common is then able to be set up as an entity within itself, and then also start to assign what's going on in terms of the positive out to those graziers. So the actual setting up of the common as a starting point is done by a central point, and it can then be linked into all of the footprints that are coming in from the graziers that are using it. How does that process happen? So again, this is some screenshots from what it looks like in terms of, as I say, once you're in the tool, you can then select to add a common land area in there. And again, that feature is able to be used by those administrators. So there is one point in terms of setting that common up. And again, that allows you to then decide, and there is flexibility built within there in terms of how you do that allocation, because again, that's something where we've had lots of discussions through this process in terms of, I don't think there is one size fits all. So you can then build in that flexibility as to how you might want to use that. So the starting point for using this tool is obviously setting up that common. Again, that is done from the central point here. That allows you to then look at what's happening in terms of the habitats that you have across the common, and what's happening in terms of activities, and that can then be linked through into those in-buy footprints. So again, this is actually where you can then start to put it in. So actually you've got your location, and all of this is done through drop downs. And then again, looking at the way that we assign this sort of thing in terms of looking at active. So on this example, we're using active livestock units, although, as I say, from feedback, we allowed that to be more flexible. And that's where the grazers can then start to be added into that footprint. As I say, the common footprint is allocated centrally. And then, as I say, we then provide that ability and that function to be able to then allocate that back out again in terms of with those graziers. So you can see that example there on different farm examples there, where you can then start to pull that bit through. For the farmers, you can then start to see where those allocations are really starting to come through then. So once the grazers are set up, they can then link that to the in-buy footprint, so that you can start to see what's happening within your in-buy land, and then how that is then contributing overall with what's happening within the commons. And again, quite simple to do. Once you are putting in your in-buy data, you can then select that it needs to be a common land report, so you can connect the two. That is done, and that allows those allocation in terms of that sequestration to be reported on the farmer footprint, and you can see how that feeds through. So when we then get to the results in terms of the in-buy at the top, and then those sort of red circled bits at the bottom are then where we can start to see what's going on in terms of the contribution from the common, both on the emissions but also on terms of what's happening within the sequestration. So, I say that's sort of been a quick flick through in terms of what the actual tool looks like. But I suppose before we move on to thinking about, you know, hearing from some of the graziers that have been involved in the project, what have we sort of learned? I suppose, firstly, I think when we started, we thought it was going to be something that we could come up with one system that would fit everything, and that's not been the case, and that's okay, because actually we've worked out that the tool really needs to be flexible in terms of making sure that it can be genuinely applied to different locations, different commons where, you know, there are different things. So we've deliberately, you know, moved on to actually making sure that it is flexible. We've also learned that there isn't a simple answer to allocation. So again, the tool has now been built so that actually you can apply multiple different approaches within them. We do also know that if we look at the body of research in terms of the information that's out there, you know, there is still gaps in terms of actually having allocations in terms of what's happening from a sequestration value within some of those habitats that we have. We know that we can use survey data, but actually making sure that it actually also reflects not just the habitat, but how that habitat is managed to make sure that we've got an accurate value is incredibly important. And so, whereas I think we are definitely moved forward in terms of having something which is, you know, which is definitely a step forward in terms of being able to account for it, making sure that we can split them all out. We're not all the way there yet. And I think, you know, it's important to sort of, you know, recognize that at that point. We have moved it forward. We have now got the ability to account for it, to make that allocation, to make sure that we've got factors which represent what's going on from an emissions perspective and a sequestration perspective. But we know that they are quite conservative figures from a sequestration perspective. And actually the ability to hone those through analysis, testing, and the ability to include the importance of management is that really important next step, which will really make sure that we've got something which genuinely, you know, genuinely feels representative of what's happening in that environment. So that's been a really quick overview, and I would just like to say, yeah, thank you very much for listening, but also a massive thank you to the commoners on Kinniside, who have been absolutely brilliant in terms of, you know, requests for data and having to pick out lots of information and look at different versions of the tool. So again, we wouldn't have got this far if it wasn't for them. So a massive thank you to those, and I look forward to coming back in for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Becky. Really appreciated that. That was really great. I should just also add that as it comes online, the Commons proof version of the carbon calculator tool will be free to use on the Farm Carbon Toolkit website and on the Foundation for Common Land website. So this is something that's going to be freely available to people. Thanks to those of you who are starting to put your questions in the Q&A. I can ask you to keep those questions in the Q&A and to go on there and upvote the questions you're interested in answering, and to ask anything else that you've got on there. And I'm going to hand over now to Will and Alan and Vicky just to talk a bit about the perspective of the commoners who have taken part in this project. So if I could ask you all to, those three people, to unmute themselves.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Becky. Really appreciate that. And thanks to Will and Vicky for being here as well. I just wanted to try and get your guys' perspective in terms of where the project sort of came from, and why you think it's important to really be looking at carbon on commons. So Will, obviously, as the association chair, was there any particular reasons why you wanted to really look at carbon on Kinniside in particular?
I think mostly, Alan, the discussion kind of came from the ongoing conversations around what carbon really meant in terms of future management. We had Natural England suggesting to us that we needed to reduce sheep numbers even further on our common in order to access the new Natural England schemes. In our case, we've actually got a rollover of our existing HLS. But really, I think that the conversations were mostly around, does carbon have a value? How can we manage carbon better if it does have a value? And actually, what does carbon mean? What does it actually mean in terms of common land management? And we were also very interested, I think, in working out the relationship between our own internal in-by land, enclosed land management, and how we actually use the common in conjunction with that land. The two things are obviously interdependent in any upland commons grazing system. So we took it from there really, but Vicky can perhaps give you a little bit more insight into some of the thinking that was coming from the graziers group.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, we've got a really good group of proactive graziers on our fell, and obviously with the subsidies degrading and there was looking for other things to come in to take place. Carbon has been talked about a lot. It's been a big subject that everybody's talking around. So that was one of the main reasons why most of the graziers were happy. They wanted to get involved, just because they could see the benefits of where if we find out the information, then we can go forward with it. If we've got the science behind it, we can go forward with that science. We think the commons are doing a good job of storing the carbon, but without having the science behind it, we can't prove that. So that was one of the main reasons why we wanted to get involved.
No, that's fair enough. Thank you. And is there anything that you've really taken from that process, Vicky? Is there one thing which sort of stands out over anything else at this point in time, at this moment?
Probably that it's not actually as scary as it first looks, because when we first get the data, the questions to put all the data in, it looks a bit scary. But once we started putting into the toolkit with Becky, it's not as difficult as it first seems, and it is doable, and we can get to net zero if we work hard at it.
Yeah. And what about you, Will? Is there one sort of, out of this whole process, is there one point that stood out more than anything else?
I think Vicky's just touched on that. It wasn't as complicated as we thought it might be. As Vicky also mentioned there, people were really enthusiastic and keen to get involved and actually wanted to know what was going on the common in terms of carbon and other parts of it as well. I think having gone through the process, as I mentioned earlier there as well, the relationship between management of your in-by land and the management of the common is actually quite important. But the other thing that is thrown up, which Becky mentioned, and it's obviously going to be a problem for everyone, is having established the situation in terms of carbon sequestration or carbon storage on the common. How do we then allocate any benefit that there might be from that common to the different individual graziers? And there has been quite a discussion, sometimes not necessarily heated, but there's been some concern from some of the graziers that they might be disadvantaged because they're not as active as in terms of actual grazing as they had been in the past. They'd reduced numbers in order to facilitate a stewardship scheme, and consequently they felt that perhaps disadvantaged themselves as a result. I'm not sure that is actually the case, but obviously there's still a lot of things to consider in terms of allocation of any benefit that might result from carbon footprinting on common land. The other thing I would say as well is that we need to understand from our landlords, in our case the National Trust, exactly what the situation is in terms of who actually owns the carbon. We have a verbal assurance from the National Trust that they would much prefer that the graziers received any benefit that came from it rather than them as landowners, which we're very grateful for. I would like to get that in writing actually, but they haven't yet done that.
So there's lots of things that we've taken from it in terms of, and I guess a few things that Becky touched on in terms of this being very much the start of a process as well. Is there a next step for you guys individually or as an association? Is there things you already have in mind about where we need to go next with it?
You want me to do this, Vicky?
Yeah, go on, Will.
Yeah, I think our next step would be, in fact, we have already kind of started down a different road to the place we were at when we actually first considered carbon footprint on the common. 3 contiguous commons up here, so Kinniside, Stockdale Moor and Nether Wasdale commons, have actually got together with all the associated in-by land and some of the infill farms as well to create a much larger area with a view to looking at how we might allocate carbon across that whole sector across that whole block of land. We've actually formed ourselves into a community interest company with a view to sort of taking a lead on how we might build something that would be something that the private sector funders might be interested in future. Where I don't know if people know where Kinniside is at, but it's about 2 miles from Sellafield nucleus plant. So we're kind of thinking that as they're developing a new reactor on site, there may be opportunities there for carbon management and biodiversity net gain payments from the commons and the surrounding land. We realise we're just for one step down quite a long road with this, but it's really quite encouraging that we've had such enthusiasm from our graziers, and they're still really keen to take it forward. We've got other people in the area that are really keen to get involved in it as well, that aren't necessarily part of our grazing group.
Thank you very much, Will and Vicky and Alan, for that. And I do all stay on board. And if we can also ask Becky to come back and join us as well. And we're just going to go straight to some questions from the chat and just ask any of you to jump in and answer those. I've got a question that's been upvoted quite a lot. Sorry, excuse me. Which is, how do the grazing livestock impact on the figures? And would the lack of grazing livestock have a positive or a negative effect on the figures? So I don't know if, Becky, you want to start with that one maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously those animals themselves are going to be generating emissions. So in terms of, we account for those. If we think about our carbon balance in terms of a set of scales, you obviously got emissions on this side in terms of and we know that's part of that system. So our grazing livestock are obviously producing methane as a result of enteric fermentation, and then also a little bit of nitrous oxide in terms of what's coming out the back end. But then also on the other side, again, in terms of how you are managing those livestock, they also are key in terms of that sort of carbon cycle and sequestration and maintaining storage and that sort of thing. So absolutely, grazing livestock have a key role in terms of managing carbon within that system. I suppose the easy bit to look at in terms of the accounting process is that emission side of it. So it's very simple to understand, how many emissions those animals are producing. And again, we're getting better and better data all the time in terms of understanding the impact of, breed, and obviously the difference between some of those upland breeds and lowland breeds, and what's happening in terms of those management. The bit that's much trickier to put into these calculators is actually what they're doing in terms of their grazing impact, because it's not a case of one value is the same all over the place. And I was just answering a question in the chat about, actually we know that these habitats and these environments are already storing a lot of carbon as a result of the fact that they are, grassland's been down for a while and all that sort of thing. So it's about understanding the opportunity to improve that carbon through the use of that grazing livestock, and actually how we can create a system where those livestock are seen as a tool to maintain that ecosystem function, and actually need to, the way they are managed can be slightly more honed, and actually that they are a crucial part of that conversation around actually how do we optimize carbon in those levels, and where the balance is between that and existing, biodiversity or other bits and pieces as well. So in terms of how we account for those within the tool, we know that grazing livestock are really important, but what's happened up until now, and is continuing to happen, is that actually it's very easy to look at the negative side of those grazing livestock because that data is there. It's a little bit more challenging without having loads of historical soil information, without understanding the inherent capabilities of how much carbon is there, to be able to account for the positive. And that's why we were in this position at the moment. We know that we can do some of that through looking at sequestration data from habitat mapping, and obviously we've had a go at doing that on Kinniside, but I don't know, Will and Vicky might be able to chip in here, but we know that actually sometimes what the habitat mapping tells us may not accurately reflect what we've got on the ground. So there's a need to ground truth that. And also within those broad habitat definitions, there's also a need to look at the impact of management. So it's quite complicated in terms of thinking about the impact of what those grazing animals are doing. And, you know, as I say, we've ended up with something that's quite simplistic in terms of just looking at them as a problem, rather than also a key part of maintaining these environments in a way which is going to achieve these multiple benefits. Sorry, Sam, that was a really waffly long answer.
No, I think that was really relevant. Thank you, and really useful. It's interesting actually hearing you say about the difficulty of mapping that, and I'm just making me wonder about one of the things we're doing on another common is actually using no fence collars, not to keep cattle in particular areas, but just to build up a much more accurate picture of where they're grazing and when. And we've been doing that to look at actually nutrient impact of different habitat grazing types. But you could think that actually layers and layers of complexity, you could also be thinking about the impact of that on mapping the impact of grazing on commoning. But I won't open up that other can of worms. I'll go instead to one of the questions that's come up in a couple of different ways, is about whether this is applying just to active graziers or to non-active common rights owners. And what about those who have rights to graze but don't use them? How are they taken into account in this?
Well, certainly, if I can just, sort of kick off, it's been the real thing where it's been the thing that we've had, I suppose, the most discussions about how we do this allocation. And I suppose we have deliberately, as I said during my presentation, we have deliberately kept it flexible, which then means that for each common, they can then, make that decision about how they do it and what they include and what they don't. Because I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where it is one size fits all. And I think from looking at some of the comments and some of the questions that get in, it is different and it is difficult. And I think it's, if we could spend the next 5 years trying to answer that question and actually not get there by the end. So I think, as I say, the way that we've built it is that actually there is that flexibility to split and do that allocation in terms of who's included and who's not, depending on what works best for that individual common. And again, that you can then state that in terms of using the tool and then pull that forward. And again, that there are potentially lots of different options that could work. So you could do it based on active livestock units. You could do it based on the fact that you're actually just going to put it all in one area and then look at who might need that in terms of that carbon as a resource. It could be that you just split it out on there are lots of different options, and it seems to be that every other group that we speak to do it in a slightly different way. So again, we've built that flexibility in, and by managing the common in the center, you can then look at what will work.
I think it's fair to say that the discussions around allocation of any potential benefit, and most people seem to think that there'll be financial benefit coming from it as well, has been the most complicated part of any conversations we've had at grazier level. Previously, of course, if you've been in stewardships, we've had a bit of a mix of active graziers and non-active graziers, both being part of the grazing group. And the conversations now seem to be from some of our active graziers that those people who aren't grazing the common aren't contributing in terms of carbon management as such, and consequently shouldn't get paid. But on the other hand, those that aren't grazing are saying they're contributing more in carbon terms because they're not grazing it, therefore their sheep aren't emitting, so they should be paid. So yeah, it's the jury's still out on that one, I think, but come back to us in about 5 years and we might have sorted it.
Also, just to add on what Will was saying, I think again it depends on if we're just looking at it on a habitat-based system, again, which is that sort of low level, we've got a starting point, or whether, as I said to when we were talking about that previous thing, whether we are taking account the impact of that grazing animal. And if we're looking at the fact that that grazing animal is potentially providing a benefit in terms of driving that carbon cycle, then that suddenly may potentially change the conversation. And I think, as I say, we've built it in a fact that we could try those things. And I think, you know, the next step for what we're looking at in terms of on Kinniside is being able to more refine those, you know, those sort of model-based results and actually look at what they might be doing in terms of a little bit of sampling to be able to then see what difference that grazing action is having.
I realise you want to push on, Sam, but we've all encountered this before with stewardship schemes where we've got non-active graziers threatening to reintroduce animals onto the common in order to be able to get some money out of the stewardship schemes, even though historically they haven't grazed for quite a long time. So the whole carbon thing does lend itself rather to that kind of same discussion, doesn't it? It's if you don't let me be part of it, I'm going to copy it up for all the rest of you, which may or may not be the case in other places, but certainly in most Lake District commons, that discussion will always be at the forefront of any conversation, I think.
Well, let's move on from one difficult question to another difficult question then. Thank you for a really valiant stab at that one, which is, put quite simply here, is does the carbon stored on commons belong to graziers or to the landowner above and below the sod? And I guess to maybe add a bit of nuance to that as well is thinking both in terms of actually the carbon that's there, but I know with finance actually what's likely to be more kind of fundable is going to be around flows of carbon. So actually thinking of flows of carbon, and particularly the complexity of situations where you may have a site owner who's carrying out capital works within their sort of remit and their rights that are restoring peatlands or peat bodies, but those capital works are only going to be successful with the collaboration of the commoners who are either maintaining or changing their grazing levels in order to make those capital works effective. So to give you that as a both a kind of really simple and a slightly more nuanced question, and see what you can do with that, maybe Becky first and then open to Will and Vicky.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really fundamental part of this whole discussion in terms of who owns the carbon and all those sort of things. I think you know, the sort of fairly simplistic way of thinking about it is that, you know, that carbon stock that's there potentially could be differentiated from that additional carbon that's being sequestered, which again is that bit that you can genuinely use as that balancing on the scales against the emissions. And it's if we can differentiate between actually the impact of that management, then again that potentially makes that process a little bit easier, because actually you can say that existing stock is what's happened in the past, but actually the method of grazing, the action that's been taken up by that grazer is what is leading to that improved carbon sequestration. And then again, if you would take that action off, that wouldn't be happening. Therefore that, you know, that makes it quite simplistic. So I think if we can get to a point, which is what we're trying to get to at the moment, where we can quantify and make valid the benefit of those grazing animals, then I think that helps move that conversation forward. I think the wider thing around, you know, potentially if we were thinking about, as you say, capital works, if we were thinking about infrastructure costs, and then it is certainly a partnership approach, and I think it's important to recognise actually the aspiration and then how we move that forward in terms of implementation. And it may well be a case that we, a bit like we were saying with allocations, we don't ever get to a point where it's one size fits all. It's actually, we have to have a sort of model that's a little bit flexible. But I think it maybe is a conversation that needs to happen in terms of actually how you know, we need to recognise the contribution that is coming from that grazier in terms of actually helping pump prime that system and keep the benefits coming. But also do it in a way which means that it can continue. So it's a bit of a fudgy answer. I don't think we're ever going to get to a one size fits all.
No, and I think very valid, Becky, and also recognising the contribution of the landowner as well, particularly when the landowner is you know, carrying out capital works or sort of making a particular contribution themselves as well. I didn't know if you wanted to come in specifically on that, Will, or related to that, and this will probably need to be our last question, but is a sort of related question specifically about Kinniside, saying what engagement has there been on the common with the owners of the common with regards to sort of carbon and natural capital opportunities on the common, i.e. offsetting from grazing and habitat management and peatland restoration. So I think you sort of touched on this a bit already in your answers to Alan, but I don't know if you want to comment on that in a bit more detail, Will, and then we'll wrap up this Q&A.
We have, as I did mention earlier, we have got a verbal agreement from our landlords, who are the National Trust, that any benefit, whatever benefit that might be in terms of carbon or biodiversity net gain, would be available to the graziers. They have the National Trust have no particular intention of claiming any financial benefit from any of this. As I say, they haven't given me that in writing, and even though I have requested it, but I guess it might set a precedent across the whole land ownership, which is significant. But we have that arrangement on Kinniside. They have been very involved in the discussions around all of this. They've attended all the meetings that we've had with Becky and our colleagues, and currently they seem very much on side with everything that we're hoping to do. Having said that, they're not involved in any capital works. Any capital works that are happening are actually being driven by the graziers rather than the landlord. So really, there are other commons in the Lake District where the complete opposite is the case, but I don't want to comment on that because I'm not directly involved. Perhaps Vicky just wants a quick word before we wrap up. Sammy, you want to say something, Vic?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, really, it's I think what we need to realise is a team effort. We've all got to work together on it either way. All the graziers are going to have to come together to do it. It can't be just one person go off on their own to try and to get their part. We're all going to have to work together to get it to work.
That's a really nice point to end the Q&A on. Actually, Vicky, thank you very much. Thank you, Becky, Vicky, Will, and Alan. I really appreciate that. I think one of the things that's really clear is just as well from the questions is just the diversity of different situations that there are on different commons as well. And that I think one of the things that Becky said, which is really valid, is that it may be that there isn't one suits all answer to these questions across all commons. There are very different commons with very different grazing patterns and different involvement. And there were a number of questions in the Q&A that we haven't got to that have sort of been about that complexity and how do we deal with that complexity. And one way is with the acknowledgement that people have to work together to find a solution that works on their own site. So I'm going to wrap up this Q&A now. Thank you. We will try and answer those other questions that haven't got answered. If you could now start adding in questions, if you do add in questions for the next speakers. So I'm going to introduce David Jones from CO2 Eco, who's going to talk, just give us a sort of introduction to carbon offsetting finance.
Thank you. And,
we've not got your slides at the moment. We've got your
you've got my mug shot.
You've got your internet. No, we just had your internet, your open internet window. The slides did flash up briefly. So if you want to go to those again.
Do you want me to reshare?
Could you reshare, please? Yeah.
Okay. The joys of technology. Well, thank you very much. It's delightful to join you. Is that being displayed now?
There, if you could just put it onto slideshow.
Voila.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Pleasure to join you this evening, everybody. CO2 Eco creates financial products to finance natural assets in the UK and overseas. And we're on a mission to raise both the price of carbon, and that hopefully will encourage good projects to get funded and underway as quickly as possible, which is what the planet needs generally. But I'm not here to sell you carbon. I'll present a really quick tour of the market with relevance to the common land. And judging by the quality of the questions that's come up already, there's a great deal of knowledge out there on the call. So I'll whiz through as fast as possible, get to the Q&A. Why, first of all, do we need a carbon market? Global emissions continue to rise despite all the national and corporate target setting. Emissions rose 1% globally last year, for example. So we should have commenced reductions years ago. And the blue line expresses the carbon budget, if you like, that's required that we've got in order to hit 1.5 degrees. And pretty much nobody now believes that that line is achievable. And therefore, carbon removals are required on a huge scale. In other words, taking carbon away from the atmosphere and storing it in soils, for example, as we discussed earlier. And that will recover the shortfall in the budget over time. The classic description of net zero is illustrated by this graph. The IPCC, and that's a four-letter jargon, but the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN scientific agency and consensus on science, estimates that by 2050, removals need to hit 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That's 10 billion tons of carbon per year, every year. Now, for illustration, if that were to be delivered only by afforestation, and of course it won't be, but were it to be, to illustrate it, that would equate to an area about 40 times the size of the UK to be planted in trees. So it's essential to reduce emissions, and as fast as possible, as illustrated by the grey line, but we also need to finance removals. The Paris Agreement formally adopted the principle of net zero and provoked the creation of voluntary carbon markets for carbon removals. And the distinction between reductions, the grey line, and the removals, the green line, is really important for them, and it affects the market for carbon because the value is different. Reductions help countries and companies push towards net zero, electrification of the grid through renewable energy being a great example of that. Removals bridge that gap and go beyond zero to recover our carbon budget deficit below the horizontal origin. And this is where farmers come in. As Becky mentioned, farming is capable of obviously creating emissions, but also removing carbon. Now, don't be too terrified by this graph. I'm only going to put it up. It's the Oxford offsetting principles, and it's a neat way of categorizing the carbon market instruments. The important takeaway is the difference between reductions and avoidance credits in orange on the left-hand side and removals in blue on the right-hand side. And farmers held the keys to boxes 4 and to a certain extent to box 5. Box 5, more jargon, but BECCS is bioenergy crops for carbon capture and storage. The growing of bioenergy crops can contribute to that, but of course it requires the storage. And biochar applications to soil are another example of a removal under box 5. But also, natural solutions deliver many other benefits, such as biodiversity. And the quality of the carbon removal schemes is therefore really important and affects the valuation of the carbon credits. And corporate buyers, I'm sure most of you know this, corporate buyers place added value on what is sometimes known as charismatic carbon. But it is complicated. The policymakers and farmers, there's pressure on land. It's illustrated by the land sparing versus the land sharing debate, for example. Government, the National Farmers Union, and others all have targets to contribute to net zero in the UK. The targets to increase woodland from 13% to 18% of UK land, hedgerows to increase by 40%, and that's just the new planting, not to mention the improvements to and enhancements to existing hedgerows and relict hedgerows. And as we discussed already on the call, livestock diets and breeding and the reduction credits are available here and there. They're not widespread schemes at the moment, but there are schemes that do pay for dietary change to livestock to reduce methane emissions, for example. So the government and companies are prepared to pay farmers to both reduce emissions and to remove and store carbon. And there are many ways to generate that income. First of all, top left, government endorsed carbon codes, such as the Woodland Carbon Code, Peatland Carbon Code, where a landowner registers a scheme to generate carbon credits in the future and can then sell those credits and can sell them now, before the carbon is captured, to companies. And there are new codes due hopefully later this year and certainly very soon for hedgerows, agroforestry, wetlands, salt marshes, and so on. Secondly, there are a few commercial products to soil carbon sequestration where farmers commit to change management practices in expectation that carbon levels will increase. We discussed that. It seems like most people on this call are aware of this. And indeed, the flow versus stock issue is a hot topic. Where carbon valuation, for example, on soil carbon sequestration, heavily influenced by the issue of permanence, i.e. the confidence over the long-term storage once captured. We may want to come back to that, particularly in the Q&A afterwards. I wrote a thesis on the UK soil carbon sequestration, so I may be able to provide some insights into the stock versus flow in particular. Then there are the top right examples there of multi-landowning and whole catchment schemes. And for the Nutrient Neutrality Initiative run by Natural England, or coordinated by Natural England, doesn't specifically encompass carbon, but of course there's a whole issue of stacking benefits. If you're receiving income for changing land use practices, for example, for one scheme, it can generate the opportunity to receive income for under other schemes, such as carbon. That also applies to biodiversity net gain. The DEFRA only last week released guidance specifically on stacking income schemes for biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality with carbon and ELMS payments, countryside stewardship, and so on. But the returns vary. These schemes are all very, very different. The quality and the nature of the scheme is all important, as touched on in the early discussion around every piece of land use and treatment of common land and circumstance being different. Finally, there are schemes being set up by supermarkets to finance farmers to transition to low carbon practices. So this is an example of Santander, joint venture with Tesco, which will pay. I'm not too familiar with the terms, but it's been around for about a year now, but there's money available, whether it's debt or subsidy, I'm not sure, to effectively help Tesco to reduce its reduce its carbon footprint in its supply chain. And there's plenty of guidance out there. This is just an example of the CLA, who are just about to issue some detailed report on carbon markets for their members, and lists a long list of issues for farmers to consider. What will happen to the future value of the carbon? Who owns the carbon? How is it accounted for? Land ownership. How landowners and tenants share costs and benefits, provisions to handle risks and losses, tax treatment, and so on. A few closing thoughts. That was a really quick canter through what is a pretty complex topic. Looking forward to discussing it in the Q&A. But I'll leave you with a few headlines. First of all, this is a very rapidly developing market, and so anything we've been talking about it's been talked about in the last year, anything we talk about tonight, things are going to be different in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, 12 months' time. Like all emerging markets, regulation with a small r or a capital R takes time to catch up with the nature of the market. In some senses, we desperately need some regulation, and some confidence around the voluntary carbon market, and to provide us all with guidance. A future value for carbon, well, if I go back to my earlier graphs, the fundamentals suggest to me that the value of carbon is just simply going to carry on going up while we fail collectively to deal with the problem and push it downstream. How that then reflects itself into the market is another matter. The quality of schemes will vary depending on all of the co-benefits and permanence and stacking of benefits that may be available under the scheme. And as I say, the value is in the eye of the beholder, in the sense of the purchaser of carbon at the moment, where carbon is not yet commoditized into, it's not a commodity, it's more like an equity in the markets. And the methods of carbon accounting, not necessarily just in the way that Becky's been describing, of how it's measured, but then how it's treated down the supply chain, who owns what. And then, of course, there's the big issue of, well, how will climate change affect the long-term value of the carbon contracts, and potentially, increase risks or change risks that the landowners face as over the term of an agreement. So I'll stop there and pass back to Sam. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate that. I'm going to go straight on now to Rosie Snowden from the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, who's going to talk a little bit about one of the main sources of stored carbon on commons, peatland and peatland restoration. So, Rosie, do you want to come on and share your screen and put your camera on?
Can you see that?
If you could just, yeah, we can see it, but could you put it onto slideshow, please?
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay, fab. Hi everyone, it's great to see so many people. Really pleased to be here and give you a quick talk on how peatland restoration, start my video. Okay, there we go. About the opportunities for managing carbon on common land. So what we're going to cover briefly, I'm going to try and talk a bit about peatlands and their importance, just to give an overview, not sure how much people know. So yeah, keen to give a brief introduction about what we're talking about, what the problem is, why we need restoration, and then finally how the farmers and the commoners can play a part in returning them to their former glory. So in the UK, we've got three types of peatland: lowland raised bog, fen and blanket bog. The one most generally found on common land is blanket bog. However, there's often a mixture of wet peaty habitats. Oops, there we go. There we go, sorry. So blanket bog is predominantly an upland habitat, differing it from lowland bogs. So it's found on hills and slopes that are consistently wet and cool throughout most of the year. Blanket bog is an exclusively rain-fed habitat, differing it from fens. It is this consistent waterlogged state due to high rainfall that is so crucial to how this habitat functions. So unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all the detail about the amazing things peatlands do for us, but I'm sure many of you are aware of all the amazing and rare wildlife supported by healthy peatlands. As you'll know, and as you can see in this image, these places are very wet, so the water content of peat is about 90%. There's more solids in a pint of milk than there are in a pint of peat. So when peatland is in good condition, full of hummocks and hollows and pools like you see here, it acts to slow the flow of water from the hills down the catchment, which helps with the huge problem of flooding and the huge millions of damages that are caused by floods every year. So not only this, but blanket healthy blanket bog also provides us with cleaner water, so it has far fewer contaminants than damaged blanket bog, which is something that water companies have to clean out at great expense. To give an idea of how much of our water comes from these environments, studies have shown that 70% of our reservoir capacity and 43% of our drinking water comes from a peaty catchment. But arguably, the most important things that peatlands do, and the topic of this talk, is store carbon. So peatlands cover only 3% of our land surface and yet store 30% of all carbon. They are the greatest store of land carbon in the world. And this carbon is locked up in the peatlands, is estimated to be twice that found in all the world's forests. So peatlands on common land have an important part to play in this story. So it's through this process of peat formation that carbon is captured. The carbon that plants take out, the carbon dioxide that plants take out of the atmosphere when they are alive is never fully cycled back into the atmosphere due to the fact that the plant material is not fully decayed. That carbon is locked up in these oxygen-poor, waterlogged habitats. So it wouldn't be possible to talk about carbon capture without mentioning sphagnum moss. This ancient group of plants is an essential part of all peatlands. There are about 35 species in the UK, and we tend to regularly see about 10 to 12. Generally, they all prefer wet and acidic conditions, and the plants themselves are built to ensure the environment around them stays favourable. They have cells that absorb and hold water, up to 15 to 25 times their own weight in water. Sphagnum mosses are the ecosystem engineers of our blanket bog habitat. They engineer this wet boggy habitat, and their presence has a huge impact on the wider habitat and is important to how peatlands function. Unfortunately, like much of our natural world, our blanket bogs are in some really bad shape. Currently, it's estimated that 80% of the UK's blanket bog is in a degraded state, and the main drivers of this are drainage, fire damage, and overgrazing. The main reason blanket bogs are degraded is due to the drainage ditches predominantly cut to make the land drier and more agriculturally productive after the wars. As we know, keeping these habitats wet is crucial to how they function, and drying them out can have devastating effects. The true benefits of blanket bogs were unknown at this stage. This in turn leads to huge gullies forming, and all of these drainage channels lower the water table, limiting the ability for blanket bogs to form new layers of peat and therefore store more carbon. Another typical scene across upland peatlands are large expanses of flat, eroding bare peat. This could be something seen after an out-of-control fire. Bare peat is extremely fragile and very susceptible to further wind and rain erosion. These areas are a huge source of carbon and greenhouse gases into our atmosphere and carbon into our water. It's very difficult for plants to colonize these areas, and this is where overgrazing can become an issue. So the trampling effect of a lot of livestock in bare areas like this can cause further erosion of the peat. If there are some plants that do manage to take root and grow but are then subjected to grazing pressure, it makes areas like this very hard to revegetate and restore. So what do we do? So projects like Yorkshire Peat Partnership can identify and plan where restoration works are necessary to restore the natural functioning capability of peatlands, and employ a range of techniques to build a detailed picture and plan for the site. So we can use drones to survey large areas in a relatively small amount of time to give up-to-date aerial photographs that help pinpoint where the drainage and erosion features are. The aerial survey also gathers surface topography data, e.g. how sloping the land is, to within a few centimetres accuracy to predict where the water is flowing. This data is then verified with a field survey to assess the quality of the habitat, categorise the erosion and damage of the peatland, and also measure the peat depth. Peat depth is a measure of how much carbon is locked up, and this helps us identify really important areas to focus on. Unfortunately, the surveying usually looks more like this. So then all of this data is brought together to form a peatland restoration plan, such as this one here, which we did for Grassington Moor, a common in the Yorkshire Dales. After we've got all that and we've got a funder, we can start on the capital works. So the number one priority is to raise the water table back to something near the surface. And we can do that by blocking the drainage grips and gullies. You can see from these images that it works. The water table is rising, and case studies have shown in other areas of the country that there has been a 33% reduction in flood peaks from grip blocking. So we know this has a real impact. So reprofiling, here's some more blocking and re-wetting, which also can restart the carbon sequestration process, because a lot of the work that we do is just focusing on reducing the emissions that are coming from our peatlands. So, but when we raise the water table like this and reintroduce sphagnum, we may even be able to start the carbon sequestration process again. Here I've just got, conscious I'm running out of time, but I've got a few more photos of restoration work. So we've got an exposed hag here where the carbon's just kind of being released into the atmosphere, and we can reprofile it and stabilize it, and then put lots of seed on there to prevent that carbon being released. And then just very briefly, so something else that partnerships like Yorkshire Peat Partnership can help with is sourcing funding. So we've got lots of different funding sources there, government, grant funds, much more private finance coming in as well. So it's just blending that finance and working out what the best mechanisms are for funding the restoration on a particular site. That was very fast and a whistle-stop tour. So yes, thank you, and ready for any questions.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and thank you, David, if you want to put your video and sound back on as well, and we can answer questions to both. Although I have to say, David and others, you've been really on it and answering questions in the chat, and I've been seeing questions being answered and disappeared, which is absolutely brilliant. I'm going to bring something in that I think you've written a typed answer to, but it kind of answers it sort of raises another question as well. Which was the question around, is there a timescale for more regulation of this market? But also just to make that question more generally, I guess more to David, but Rosie, you may well have something to come in on this as well, which is just around how does someone, either a commons owner or commoners, looking at entering these markets, how do they make the decision around when is the right time to engage with this funding, with things changing so rapidly, and with you being asked to commit often to sort of 30-year agreements, when you don't know whether there's going to be sort of, you know, changes which render those agreements less or more attractive. So I don't know if either of you want to kind of come in on how people negotiate that, really.
Well, as a very quick answer to your first question around the timing of regulation, which is there's no answer to that. So, you know, the government is pretty hands-off, and well, I don't know. The more carbon codes would help, but they are terribly, terribly slow to emerge. In regards to your second question about, you know, when's the best time to enter the carbon market? Well, most farmers I've met are quite good business people, and they can weigh up the offer on the table. I think that one thing you shouldn't do, I don't think, is to sell carbon at spot price. Let's put it that way. You know, so receive your income as it goes in the short term, because the carbon price really should be going up. But unfortunately, there are very few decent offers on the table at the moment for, say, take peatland and woodland carbon, where the two codes exist. There are very few sensible offers on the table for forward carbon that I would think are properly valuing the carbon in the long term. So yeah, care needed to go into these deals and with sort of 20-30 year horizons. One thing I would say is maybe, you know, look, if you've got an ambition, for example, to plant trees or restore peatland, and need cash to do it, then sell part of the carbon, not all of it. You don't have to sell it all.
Rosie, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I'd agree with that last point. And also just add that I suppose from our perspective, we're seeing government grants going down in terms of percent that they will be offering to fund. So at the moment, the Peatland Code requires 15% private finance, but the grants, the current government grants are saying they're only providing 75% government grant funding. So we're anticipating that the government funding is only going to go down. So sort of now is a good time to capitalize on that large amount of government funding. Yes, if you did think that Peatland Code was a good way to go, you don't have to sell any at the start. You can sit on it and see what happens with the carbon market. We've got some potentially big investors like ready to kind of invest in this kind of thing, and just need more assurance really from government and from schemes, because we're hearing from a lot of farmers that they're really reticent to sign up to anything, like you say, 30-year agreements if they don't know what's happening with elms. So we need some more reassurance for government to help people make the right decisions.
That's really valid. Thank you, Rosie. And I guess that point, really useful message there as well, that you know, you're not actually committing to sell anything by carrying out the Peatland Code, but you're getting a baseline which will enable you to do more in the future. And certainly that you don't want to be doing any restoration work without having that baseline in place, so that you can you know where you're going from there. So that's a really useful point. Thank you. We had I wanted to kind of come back to so there were a couple of questions really, I guess, around that we had in the Q&A that I think have been answered, but that sort of seem relevant for discussion, around the balance between sort of public and private finance. Both from one question was from a sort of I guess a kind of ethical and societal point of view, saying you know, shouldn't we be incentivizing this through public finance rather than as a traded market? And one more generally about how do you sort of balance off going for, and how do you stack sort of ELM type funding and private finance? So if you can kind of treat those, so that was a slightly a bundle of questions there, but if you'd like to come in, I don't know who would like to come in on that first. Rosie, do you want to come in on that, or David, are you?
I can give a short answer. So I guess what we're hearing from Natural England is that the two sort of schemes, so a carbon scheme and an agro-environment scheme, won't count. You can do both at the same time, is what they're saying. What was the first part of your question? I did have an answer to it.
Well, there was a general question about whether as a society the right thing is to be incentivizing this as offsetting, or whether we should be just funding restoration through public money.
Well, I suppose we are doing both. There's lots of funding through public finance from the government, and in terms of the corporate private finance, there's lots of restrictions about they can't just be greenwashing. It has to be the absolute last step into their journey to net zero. So it's kind of mitigating those emissions that can't be reduced or removed. So there's that kind of ethical side of it, which the Peatland Code covers.
David, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Rosie, but I'd add two more things. I mean, first of all, to save ourselves and actually to bring income to hard-pressed farming communities, we need to do everything all at once as fast as possible. And frankly, this government and no government will have the money to pay for all of the interventions that are required. I mean, £2.6 billion just isn't going to go very far. Won't do very many trees or hedgerows, let alone soil and methane and so on. And the second point is that the problem with public finance is it's very short term. So countryside stewardship is about as far in advance as governments are prepared to commit, which I think is 5 years, and in very occasional cases it's 10 years, I think. Well, the life cycle of natural assets, and frankly the encouragement for landowners and farmers to make permanent change to their management practices and their land use, is intergenerational. And so, actually private finance and long-term agreements can help to encourage that, and certainly stacking both public and private finance is essential. And I would add that DEFRA have helped a bit in the last week to clarify the rules on stacking, but unfortunately they omitted to mention anything about carbon. They kind of focused on biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality, but hopefully they will clarify carbon in the very near future.
Thank you. It wasn't actually a question, but there was a discussion in the chat around somebody made the comment that they've sort of been told or they've thought that actually any spare carbon they have, they need to offset their farming practices. They'll have a comment in the chat saying I need any spare carbon I have to farm. And a kind of discussion about that, and I just wondered if you wanted to kind of join in on that, and what's the relationship between actually dealing with the offsetting your own farm business before you're sort of looking at selling any excess.
Well, I suppose my quick short answer to that is there are no carbon accounting rules that tell you that that's the case. So if Tesco, if you were producing wheat or barley for the Tesco supply chain, for example, to what extent is there a rule anywhere that says that the woodland or the hedgerows that you have alongside the crops, even the soil, contributes to the carbon intensity of the crop leaving the farm in any given season? There are no rules. So what I would say pragmatically is maybe don't sell all the carbon then, hedge your bets.
I think perhaps as well, increasingly, the ability to market products as farm products as carbon neutral and to offset for that purpose is going to be important as well, not as a different sort of economic driver potentially. Okay, we're going to round up the Q&A very shortly. I'm just looking for a few of the other more sort of upvoted questions. One around a question here. Peat locks up carbon but also creates methane, which has potential greenhouse gas effects. Has research been done about this? And also with longer drier periods we're getting nowadays, isn't there a risk of peat drying out or even catching fire increased? Rosie, do you want to start with that question?
Yes. So yes, methane is released from certain systems, particularly some of those like really wet pools that you saw in the photos. So where you've got standing water, you can get methane released there. Yes, there's research being done on it. Methane's a different kind of greenhouse gas, so it's more potent, but it's much shorter lived. And the science is, I think, starting to show now that the carbon dioxide is more important, but it does balance out. And I think in a functioning wet peat bog, the greenhouse gas, it's like either level or just sequestering. So it's not a huge amount, but because of that methane. And then the second part was, yes, if with climate change and more droughts. So that's a really good point, but it just shows that it's even more important that we get the restoration done and keep these areas wet, because we're seeing in the droughts that we've had recently, we're seeing that where we've done restoration and where there's lots of sphagnum, that the sphagnum actually keeps the peatland wet. and is providing havens for wildlife, and is making the whole bog more resilient to climate change effects like drought and increased risk of wildfire, because it's being kept wet throughout the drought. So it's just even more important that we get this restoration and get the sphagnum back in.
Thank you, really appreciate that, Rosie. And then I just wondered, before we finally wrap up, David, if you wanted to just come back in, you mentioned that, and we haven't actually asked you anything on this, but you mentioned that you might have a bit more to say on the issue of carbon stocks versus carbon flows, which I think is really relevant to some of the questions we were discussing earlier, particularly with respect to, you know, what's the role of the landowner and the role of the common rights owner in contributing to and attributing sort of the benefit of peatland restoration. So do you have anything more to say about that? And you're muted at the moment, David.
Two parts to your question, really, I suppose. I mean, first of all, the stock versus flow. I mean, my thesis concluded that you know, soil actually is pretty tricky for two reasons. One is two principal reasons. One is that permanence is very difficult to guarantee, impossible to guarantee, I would argue, and secondly, that it's, you know, soil carbon is terribly difficult to measure with any consistency and rigor. Things are getting better on the latter, but that means what I concluded, I think, is that conceptually, and you touched on it actually, Sam. Conceptually, it seems right that where there's a buoyant and trusted carbon market, that the sequestration, the flow, should be paid for, accounted for potentially by the private sector, while the stock could be paid for by the public sector. And so I could go into more detail about that, but I'm sure we haven't got time as to why there's some logic to that. The second part to your question is really, you know, the tenant versus landowner kind of issue, and of course, I mean, it very much depends on. It's impossible to draft a standard agreement for all circumstances, and particularly for upland peat. I'm sure Rosie's got more to say on this, but I think that it is always possible to share benefits and risks and costs and obligations in any legal agreement. But, you know, it very much depends on the status and circumstances of both parties and the particular bit of land you're talking about, and this, you know, the timescales and so on.
That is a very nice, and I won't go back to Rosie, I'm afraid, because we're just creeping towards the end of our time, and that's a very nice, rounded and nuanced answer to end on to a difficult question. So thank you, David. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you to all of our other participants. I would say to everyone that's on the call, if you did miss any of this, we're going to send out a link to the video afterwards. That will be available on the Foundation for Common Land's YouTube page. Please do share that with anyone that you think that hasn't attended, that you think might be interested in it. It is readily available to anyone. Anyone who has registered can join it. Will get a link to that, but anyone can see that. And please do stay signed up to our newsletter, or sign up to it if you haven't done so already. Please do look on the Foundation for Common Land website for more upcoming webinars. We don't have a date for a next webinar, but we will have webinars coming up on the tricky issue of trees on common land, webinars coming up on how do we secure collaboration over capital works on common land, webinars around how do we tell the story of commoning to the public. So there's some really interesting topics coming up, and as well as our regular webinars on on news around ELM as it develops, and news from our test and trials that the Foundation for Common Land is currently running. So please do look at Foundation for Common Land. Please follow us on Twitter for news of new webinars. And thank you so much for everyone for attending and for the great questions that people have put in the Q&A. They really bring this thing to life, and they really make it work very well. Yeah, just thank you all again, and I will now bring that to the end. Thank you.